The conference room smelled faintly of jasmine and lemon polish, a clean, practiced scent meant to reassure. Light from the atrium fell across the marble in long, cool rectangles. When Mr. Jang stepped over them, his reflection moved like a careful, black card sliding through gold embossing. He carried himself with an economy of motion that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Harrison's throat went dry. Before anyone could speak, Olivia paused just outside the glass and listened. If this were a film, the shot would have widened then. Chandeliers, a long table, the hotel's executive team arranged like a set of chess pieces. In reality, the geometry was the same, but smaller. The thud of heels in the corridor, the whisper of a service cart, the ping of a smartphone against the belt. Olivia's uniform was gray, practical. Her hands were smooth by habit. The rings on her knuckles caught the light when she adjusted the cart. People looked past her in the way institutions learn to look past certain bodies. If you like stories about unseen work being seen, stay with this one until the end. There's a quiet solution here and a question that lingers about who gets noticed where you work. If this reaches you, consider subscribing. It helps more small, true stories find their way. Olivia had been at the Wellington for 6 years. She knew the back stairways better than the maps given to new managers. She knew which room received jasmine in the diffuser every Tuesday and which guest squinted at the minibar prices and counted them as a personal affront. She knew the exact time the morning shift finished and the precise curvature of the brass handle on the linen closet door. She also knew, from the neat fold-flat way she shaped the corners of a pressed sheet, how to make a bed look like an altar. There were things about Olivia that even a year of cleaning the same wing didn't explain. A slim leather wallet with an embassy seal tucked into the lining of her locker, a student loan notice folded and then refolded until the paper grew soft in one corner, the faded spine of a Chinese English phrasebook that had lost its glue. She carried a master's degree in East Asian studies in the way some people carried a scar. Private, precise, a fact you saw only if you looked for it. Nights in Beijing had taught her to listen for cadence and for the way a pause could mean different things in different dialects. They had taught her to be careful with pride. Harrison stood at the head of the table, palms braced on polished wood, fingers splayed like someone trying to anchor himself. He had been promoted twice in 5 years and had an appetite for the sort of recognition that came with engraved nameplates. The investor dinner tonight was not merely a deal. It was a promise of expansion, of a portfolio that might include the Wellington under a regional brand, of a smaller, greener economy for the hotel, and with it, a pathway to a bonus that paid off certain municipal favors Harrison had been angling toward. Behind his smile hummed a fear of exposure. "Executive summary," he mouthed to Miss Lin, the consultant assigned to manage language services. She tapped the tablet, then produced a headset from a small black case and a thin smile that barely held. Miss Lin spoke several languages with the steadiness of someone who never had to prove fluency. Tonight, however, her equipment, an external translator plus live relay, had been delayed in shipping. She had arrived with an app and an apologetic look. Mr. Jang took the offered seat at the far end. He had asked for the suite, not merely the table. That night, the Wellington had turned the executive suite into a small theater. A soundly chosen selection of wines, a course of seafood prepared on a mise en place showpiece, and a single black card with gold embossing set before Mr. Jang, a token of the handshake Harrison hoped to secure. The card was a symbol, not merely wealth, but the right to move where capital slept. Harrison began with numbers. He had practiced his cadence and the weight of the sentences that sounded like certainty. He spoke of occupancy rates, conversion metrics, a planned renovation that would make the Wellington a premium destination for regional executives. He handed a printed packet across the table, and his team nodded through their talking points like markers on a map. Mr. Jang listened but did not incline. His response was small, an almost invisible twining of his fingers around the spine of his portfolio, and it told Harrison nothing. Then he asked in Mandarin about something buried in the packet: municipal tax levers that apply to integrated hospitality developments, recent zoning incentives the city had teased into the public hearings, and the practical impact on revenue forecasts should the Wellington agree to modify its catering obligations to local suppliers. He asked the question not to bait, but to understand the legal seams, the very edges where risk could leak. Miss Lin's translation came through the headset in a voice that hummed with delay. The app's algorithm tried to stitch industry vocabulary into conversational cadence, and it failed. Where nuance mattered. He asks about local tax benefits. He asks, if the proposed partnership aligns with the municipal redevelopment incentives. He means, will the expansion be eligible for the tax referral? No one at the table could name the specific clause. The controller leafed through spreadsheets as if they might cough up a clause. The chef shrugged and suggested that a supply chain change could be piloted. An associate muttered about contracts. In the corner, someone from securities cross-checked the packet on his phone and then locked the screen with a visible expression of concern. Harrison smiled too wide. "We have preliminary advice," he said. "Our legal team—" The phrase faltered. His voice tapped against the sentence in his chest. "We can provide the necessary documentation to interface with municipal boards." Mr. Jang's eyes, dark and calculating, did not soften. He accepted the word interface as one might accept a surface weather report. Then he asked another question in Mandarin. Could the Wellington guarantee that integration would not expose the investor to local content requirements that had been tagged to the advancement packages? It was a technical ask, not ideological. It required someone to speak the language of local governance, to know the difference between a tax holiday and a phased rebate, to understand what local content meant in practice for catering, staffing, and procurement. Silence settled like a cloth over the tabletop. That silence was not an absence, but a negotiation in which the hotel was already losing. The translator lagged and then looped. Miss Lin's face flattened into a palette of professional worry. Harrison caught himself reaching for a phrase he did not have. Olivia was restocking the hospitality tray in Suite 702 when the tension pushed past the glass. The linen for the executive suite changed hands at noon. She had just folded an extra set of napkins when the stuttering Mandarin reached her like a stone dropped into still water. She paused, the corner of a square napkin pinched between two fingers. The sound of a language does something to memory the way scent does. It stirs chambers. For Olivia, the language was a door. She had learned Mandarin in classrooms that smelled of chalk and old tea, at midnight language tables where her classmates argued over tones and honorifics, at a scholarship program that had insisted she breathe new forms of grammar until they nested in her chest. Her thesis had been a modest, stubborn piece on municipal incentives in second-tier Chinese cities and the ways international hospitality projects learn to navigate local content demands. She had argued, then as now, that success in such projects came from granular local knowledge, and from people who both spoke the right legalese and understood the kitchen floors where food was born. She had not told many people at work about Beijing. She had not worn her degree on a lanyard. It had felt like asking for an invitation to humiliation, some small bureaucratic correction of the dignity of being a maid. The maintenance boy, the bellman, the concierge, they knew her as reliable. The managers knew her as Olivia from housekeeping. That classification was a cost she learned to budget for. She slid the tray into its service cart with an almost invisible steadiness and told herself to keep walking. There are moments when a person can be bold, and moments when restraint is survival. She had been reprimanded once, several years before, for speaking up about a broken heating vent in a VIP room. The manager who had done the reprimanding used a phrase that lodged in her "mind your station," and she had, after that, learned the small art of making her competence unreadable by those who might find it inconvenient. But there was a heat under the skin now, a tightening that felt less like danger and more like time fraying. Mr. Jang had asked something specific. The hotel needed someone who could explain, in precise Mandarin, how the local incentives worked and what red lines might exist. Harrison looked around the table, and nowhere in that formal lineup was a hand with the right knowledge. The table trembled with potential failure. Olivia's hand found the leather wallet in her pocket, a thin, slightly soft thing with an embassy crest debossed on the inside flap. She had placed there months ago a business card she had been given by Professor Lee at Peking University, a mentor who had told her once, in a voice made careful by years of correcting exam papers, that knowledge without circulation is a kind of theft from oneself. If you can speak, he'd said, speak where it matters. Olivia had kept the card like a small, private proof. She heard Miss Lin say haltingly, for an English paraphrase, "He asks whether, will the investment be eligible for offsetting against municipal taxes if the accommodation uses a certain percentage of local suppliers?" Harrison's attempt to answer rushed without authority. The controller's fingers hovered over a spreadsheet like a man trying to locate a map in the dark. Around Olivia, the corridor went quiet. The cleaning cart's wheels made a soft, stubborn sound against the stone. She could walk away and let the professionals flounder. She could keep the fact of her education private and accept the inequality. But the answer in her head was already unspooling, technical, precise, patient as a legal brief. She thought of the student loan notice folded in her locker and the way the numbers refused to be abstract. She thought of the evenings translating community guidelines for a local NGO that had nothing to do with the Wellington's clientele. She thought of a line in her thesis, an observation, careful and not very proud, that infrastructure projects succeed when they are linguistically and operationally embedded in local systems rather than when they parachute in with glossy promises. She thought of Professor Lee's card and of the tiny distances between being seen and being useful. At the table, Harrison swallowed and smiled through a sentence that had no real meaning. Mr. Jang watched him. A beat, then Mr. Jang looked toward the door. Harrison tried to move, to recover the room, to shift the responsibility back to consultants. He began. Then something in the room tightened further. He could not find the language. His choices were constricted to the cadence that had worked before, to press releases and optimistic forecasts. The hotel had placed too much on the table. Expectation wrapped in opportunity. Now the table threatened to fold. Olivia set her hand on the stainless handle of the service cart. Her gloves were thin cotton and smelled faintly of lemon. She could feel the callus at the base of her thumb from years of tucking sheets into corners. She removed one glove. The skin of her hand met the cool metal, and for a moment the world narrowed to a single verbal possibility. Explain the incentives in Mandarin, clarify the municipal conditions, salvage the negotiation. Her mind ordered the facts in the same way she made beds, a corner first, then the pull, then tuck. Municipal offering A was conditional on a 3-year commitment to sourcing 50% of catering from local vendors. Incentive B offered a phased rebate contingent on the training of local staff. The city's paperwork required specific documentation. That documentation, she realized, would be within reach of a person who could explain how local content rules trickled down into procurement clauses. There were reasons to hold back. She would be stepping into a room where no one expected to see her voice. She might be chastised again, or worse, dismissed with a paternalistic pat. Harrison might feel undermined. The hotel might prefer the polished humiliation of a failed meeting to the messy appearance of having invited a maid to speak. Olivia weighed the risks as she had weighed many small choices in her life. And then she felt something else, an urgency that was not only for herself. Mr. Jang's investment could mean new hires, a cadence of better contracted wages, opportunities for back-of-house staff to be integrated into planned supplier programs. She lifted her chin and pushed the cart with a steady hand. The glass door breathed open. Conversation at the table slowed, like a stitch pulled through fabric. Mr. Jang turned his gaze. Heads moved in a coordinated, mechanical lurch. The hush felt brutal and full. Harrison's face contracted. He saw a uniform at the threshold and read it as an interruption. The gesture he made, half summons, half shutdown, was a reflex shaped by the years in which hierarchy had protected him. He started to say Olivia as though the name alone might correct whatever social transgression was about to occur. She stepped into the light. The room registered her as if for the first time. There was a small collective pause, a microhistory that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with how institutions had arranged attention. Olivia looked at Mr. Jang and met his eyes. He inclined his head, not with condescension, but with interest. She leaned forward across the table and, in Mandarin, began, Mr.
Jang, regarding the municipal incentives you mentioned, if the Wellington commits to a phased local procurement plan and provides documentation of staff training over 3 years, the city offers a 20% rebate applied over the first 2 fiscal years. And an expedited zoning variance is possible if the project includes community engagement clauses. English paraphrase rippled through the headset like clean water. Miss Lin's eyes widened with the recognition of someone hearing meaning arrive intact. Papers shifted. Harrison's smile cracked. Olivia continued, calm, her voice a thread of business and translation woven together. She not only translated Mr. Jang's concerns, she answered them, listing the evidence the city would require, the likely local suppliers who could meet the hotel standards, and a practical pilot plan, 6 months, venue scale adjustments, certified training modules with measurable outcomes. She named precedents in neighboring districts where similar projects had succeeded because procurement had been handled in partnership with local cooperatives. Olivia's Mandarin was not just fluent, it carried the inflection of someone who had lived the scales of demand and bureaucracy. She spoke with the economy of someone who had argued her way through academic committees and with the practical register of someone who had lived with budgets. She offered 2 options and a recommendation. At first, the room heard her as a translation. Then, gradually, they heard her as a strategist. Harrison's mouth made a sound that might have been protest but did not complete. He had controlled many rooms with his certainty. He had not planned for a subversion that was both gentle and effective. The control he prized pivoted under his hand like a mislaid tray. For a second, he thought of the reprimand years ago, of being told to mind his station. He felt, as he had rarely allowed himself to feel, the cold pinch of humiliation. Mr. Jang listened without expression, then nodded minutely. He took out his black card, the gold emboss catching light, and turned it in his fingers as if to test its weight. Very good, he said in English haltingly at first, then in Mandarin with a clarity that made everyone in the room sit straighter. Your plan addresses the practicalities. This is the kind of integration that persuades an investor that a project is not merely profitable, but sustainable. There was a sound behind that phrase, relief, like a chamber opening. Olivia felt it pass through the room the way a breeze moves through curtains. Harrison was shaken. He had not imagined that his vulnerability would become visible in the presence of someone he had hoped to impress. He exhaled an apology that felt both necessary and true. The controllers began to ask more detailed, now informed questions, and Olivia answered. She cited a prior case, not as brag, but as a map, then suggested a local supplier the Wellington could vet. She described training modules that could be certified within weeks and how documentation could be prepared to satisfy municipal auditors. Her competence stitched the torn parts of the meeting back together. Afterward, in the corridor, Harrison found her by the linen closet. He did not know how to be both contrite and managerial at once. He hovered between both. Olivia, he said, his voice roughened by the realization that he had been bluffing. Thank you. I should have. She met his apology without needing it to be a settlement. She accepted his thanks like a tool. He squeezed her shoulder in a way that was awkward and halfway to genuine. "We need to talk about respecting how we use our staff. There are things I didn't see." "You can start by seeing them," Olivia said. Her words were neither triumphal nor small. They were exactly those two things, which is to say, simply true. Mr. Jang walked out with a new glint in his appetite for the Wellington. He left his card on the table and promised, slowly, carefully, to connect the hotel with his partners. He spoke of piloting a suite of integrated properties. He thanked Olivia personally, in Mandarin that asked nothing more than competence be acknowledged. In the days that followed, the story of a maid who had saved the meeting circulated at the Wellington like a rumor that felt too plausible to be dismissed. Some colleagues treated the tale as a correction, clumsy and late. Others saw in it an opportunity, an exposed seam where the hotel's management might finally stitch talent into policy. Harrison convened a meeting with the human resources director and the executive team. The maintenance student who had watched from the back of the room, eyes wide, found himself included in a staff debrief where HR promised an audit of skills and background that might reveal other competencies. Olivia returned to her rounds with a quietness that was not the same as before. She had not expected thunder. She had expected a practical fix and perhaps a reprimand. Instead, she carried with her the echo of Mr. Jang's words and a new set of forms to sign. A memo requesting that she consult on international guest relations, an informal, experimental role to begin with. She read the memo twice and felt a small, private shiver. When the promotion letter arrived a month later, an official title, a small office with a window that looked out on the service yard, and a framed appointment, Olivia hung the black card in her wallet next to Professor Lee's business card. She thought of the jasmine diffuser in the suite and the way recognition had a scent too, if only in memory. The hotel's directors had agreed to pilot what would be called, clumsily at first, the Hidden Talents Initiative. An audit of staff skills, a directory of fluencies and certifications, and a small training budget to formalize internal development. Emma, the head of housekeeping, would be involved. The maintenance student would be offered a pathway to apprenticeship in facilities management. The statistics in the epilogue were not theatrical. 12 staff members identified with previously unrecognized professional experience. 5 internal promotions within 6 months. A measurable increase in staff retention in back-of-house roles. The Wellington adjusted its supplier matrix to include 2 local cooperatives. The municipal rebate paperwork was filed with the clarity Olivia had suggested. Mr. Jang's contact led to a small strategic integration that left the hotel's bottom line healthier and its staff a touch more secure. Harrison did more than apologize. He initiated a quarterly review of staff competencies, invited Olivia to sit in on hiring panels, and made a public note at the next all-hands meeting about the cost of institutional blindness. He did not get everything right. Humility is a practice more than a place. But he began to allow other authoritative voices into the rooms he had once closed. Where he had once relied on curated presentations, he started to ask for frontline input. The change was not instantaneous, but neither was it symbolic only. It produced new pipelines and, more quietly, a culture that prized evidence over assumption. Olivia kept her apartment small and tidy. On the wall above her narrow desk, she hung the diploma from her master's program, a small, tidy rectangle that did not make noise but made a presence. She left Professor Lee's card in its place, flattened into the wallet. In the afternoons between calls with potential local suppliers and meetings to craft the Hidden Talents Initiative, she made time to teach a 2-hour weekly class for staff interested in language work and customer diplomacy. She taught people how to listen for cadence, how to ask questions that invited useful information, and how to write a line that could be read by municipal clerks. She also thought of the many invisible labors that would not be fixed by one institution's program. She thought of how institutions tend to notice only when something breaks. She thought of the maintenance student who had watched her with wide eyes and the bellman who had helped her carry out a cart without comment.
The work of recognition would be slow. The black card, the symbol that had once meant only appetite and reach, found another role. When Mr. Jang's assistant called to check on the piloting contract, Olivia took the card from her wallet and set it on her desk, like an anchor. She had won something more practical than a title. She had opened a small channel through which other unseen skills could travel. That channel, she decided, would be explicitly maintained. She called the first meeting of the Hidden Talents Initiative in a small room near the service elevators. The notice on the staff board used careful language. Inventory of skills and opportunities. The sign-up sheet had slots that asked staff to list language fluencies, previous education, certifications, and interests. Emma put her name down for a management training course. The maintenance student circled apprenticeship in heavy penciled letters. Olivia sat at the table and listened as the names and histories were spoken aloud and then recorded. There was a ceremonial moment she did not stage but welcomed. At the last staff meeting before the pilot contract was signed, Mr. Jang returned to the Wellington. He stood in front of the back-of-house staff, a group that rarely received the eyes of high investors, and thanked them personally for the role they played in hospitality. He handed a small formal card to the maintenance student and, with a short smile, said it was people like him who made large investments plausible. The maintenance student's grin was wide and a little incredulous. Olivia watched him and felt, for a second, the domestic world and the financial world meet. The program produced numbers that management loved to read aloud at quarter ends. Retention up by 18% among back-of-house staff. Internal promotions leading to saved recruitment costs. Local supplier integration that reduced certain overheads. But the real metrics were not all on spreadsheets. The controller, who had once looked up from spreadsheets with weary eyes, now nodded to the kitchen staff in the corridor. The bellman, who had once scowled at overtime, now mentioned the class he had taken in hospitality management, courtesy of an internal scholarship. Harrison, who had once prized image over substance, found himself praising small, practical improvements in public meetings. As for Olivia, she kept making beds. She still folded napkins into neat points and still tucked corners with practiced hands. But she did so from an office with a window and a phone that occasionally rang with external inquiries. She taught a weekly class and wrote a brief internal guide for the hotel: how to document local procurement practices, how to build training modules in partnership with municipal auditors, how to validate a worker's prior experience. When she walked the corridors now, people looked up. Recognition, she discovered, had its own smell. It was not jasmine and not lemon polish. It was the dust settling after something that had been invisible was finally held to light. The dust settled differently then, no longer just residue on a ballroom floor, but a fine layer that could now be seen and, crucially, cleaned in a way that acknowledged whoever had swept it. She kept Professor Lee's card in her wallet long after she no longer needed it. Once, when Harrison came by to consult about supplier contracts, he found the card on Olivia's desk and asked about it. She told him, simply, that she had studied municipal incentives and that knowledge had turned what might have been a loss into a partnership. Harrison listened, and then, small and sincere, he asked how to make sure the Wellington did not forget this lesson. "Listen," Olivia said. "Ask the people who know the rooms. Make the staff directory a document you consult, not a form you fill. Find the words to invite people to speak, and don't make talent have to risk shame to be useful." In the months that followed, more than one unseen skill appeared on the staff inventory. A dishwasher who had been a mechanic in another life found work in facilities maintenance. A front desk associate with a background in finance helped redesign a petty cash reconciliation. Small promotions multiplied. The maintenance student began an apprenticeship. Emma's management course was completed and she was promoted to operations supervisor on a pilot payroll schedule that paid her shifted hours properly.
A year later, the Wellington released an internal report on the Hidden Talents Initiative. The numbers filled a single-page memo with tidy columns, but the narrative sentences that accompanied the figures were more telling. By consciously soliciting staff competencies, the Wellington improved operational resilience, staff satisfaction, and supplier integration. Institutional humility, accepting that expertise may exist outside conventional roles, proved both ethical and profitable. Olivia read the memo and thought of the night she had removed her glove and stepped across the threshold. She remembered the pinch of fear and the clarity that followed. She thought of Professor Lee's words and the small proof of them. Knowledge circulated. She placed the memo in a desktop folder next to her notes on municipal documentation. She did not expect any fanfare. She did not want it. In the stead of ceremony, there were small reconciliations. Harrison inviting Emma to sit in budgeting meetings. A new line on the hotel's website acknowledging staff development programs. A modest plaque in the staff corridor that read simply, "We see the work that makes us whole." None of it erased the structural inequities that made such programs necessary. Olivia thought of other hotels, other institutions, where no one would notice the seam until it frayed entirely. She thought of her friends who worked in restaurants and warehouses and who navigated the daily calculus of being seen only when a problem demanded visibility. On a Thursday afternoon, as she filed a set of procurement guidelines and answered an inquiry from Mr. Jang's assistant about supplier credentials, Olivia paused and glanced at the framed diploma on her wall. The glass caught the light, and she could see faintly the reflection of the corridor where staff moved like small rhythms of labor. She smiled, not a triumphal arch, but the quiet contentment of someone who had, in a practical way, shifted the axis of attention in a place where attention had long been rationed.
People asked her, later, whether she had expected anything when she had stepped into the conference room. She said no. She had expected, at most, a conversation. What she found was the labor of translation, the practice of making complexity speak across power, and of bearing the burden of clarity until others could carry it. The Wellington went on. Investors came, contracts were signed, and the hotel expanded one wing to house more integrated suppliers. The black card remained a symbol on the desk where Olivia drafted training modules. It was not that the card had lost its power. It was that its meaning had been broadened. It could now stand for partnership that included the people who kept rooms tidy and food cooked and lights polished. The card could be a token not only of appetite, but of responsibility. On quiet nights, Olivia would walk the back corridors, passing the linen closets and the service elevators. She would acknowledge the maintenance staff, the laundry crew, the kitchen porters. They would nod, some with surprise still in their faces, others with the slow ease of people who had always known they deserved this and were simply, finally, being seen. There was a question the story left open for anyone who had watched. Who is invisible in your world, and what would happen if you invited them to speak? That was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a practical challenge, phrased not as rebuke, but as possibility. Institutions can change, Olivia had shown, if someone with the courage to bridge languages and statuses steps forward, and if the work of listening is made routine instead of exceptional. But the pivot, the moment everyone remembered, had been neither mystical nor theatrical. It had been a woman removing a glove, stepping through glass, and saying the right things at the right time. It was, in the end, both small and enormous. Outside the Wellington, the city continued its own negotiations, zoning hearings, municipal meetings, the endless paperwork of public life. Inside, the Wellington adjusted and kept a careful log of staff skills. The maintenance student completed his apprenticeship and, in time, was asked to consult on retrofit plans for the new wing. Harrison learned, imperfectly but earnestly, to ask frontline staff for input. Mr. Jang included the Wellington in a modest portfolio expansion that favored hotels with proven local procurement plans. Olivia kept teaching and kept her wallet with an inward sense of balance. She would sometimes receive emails from other hotels asking for her notes on the Hidden Talents Initiative. She sent them, in due course, as a matter of habit. There was a warmth in that, paying forward the kind of recognition that had once come to her unexpectedly. And sometimes, late at night, when the hotel's lights softened and the marbles cooled, she would stand in the lobby and watch the reflections. People moving, glints of light, small domestic dramas playing out in the polished surfaces.
She would think of dust, not as detritus, but as evidence of use. She would think of visibility, not as a destination, but as a practice. One that required routine checks, invitations to speak, and persistent attention. When the next investor visited, Harrison did not lead the meeting alone. He invited Olivia to sit at the table from the beginning. She arrived without gloves, her hands bare, and the meeting proceeded differently because someone had chosen to distribute attention where it had been scarce. The room's jasmine diffuser was set to a low hum. The black card lay on the table like a neutral artifact. The investor, Mr. Jang, had his own tastes. He asked the right questions, and when he did, Olivia answered, not as an anomaly, but as an integral voice at a table that had learned, slowly, to widen. There were no banners. There was no single dramatic coronation. There was, instead, a series of small, sustained acts that altered the atmosphere of an institution that had once been content to look the other way. Recognition, in this version, was less a sudden spotlight and more a redirection of the spotlight's aim. If you are sitting in an office or a workshop or a classroom right now, it is worth asking, who speaks for the rooms that make your institution function? Who could be invited to the table not as a token but as a contributor? The Wellington's change did not hinge on a single hero. It hinged on the willingness to see. But someone had to step forward first. And that person, in this story, was a maid who knew Mandarin and the municipal levers like the inside of her own sleeve. The story ends not with a flourish, but with a practical program, a sign-up sheet, a training module, a budget line. The important thing was not to make the maid into a myth, but to make the act replicable. Olivia's glory, if one insists on the word, was not an end, but a method. She built a bridge and then invited others to cross it. There are other hotels, other industries, other meetings. Perhaps you will think differently now of the person who brings your coffee, or the janitor who silently keeps your lights on, or the clerk who has a degree folded into a pocket. Recognition takes patience and systems. It also takes the occasional brave step across a threshold. And yet, even as the Wellington adjusted and the numbers improved, Olivia still folded napkins with the same exacting care. There was dignity in the craft and dignity in the new role. She kept both. Outside, in the city, the business of investment churned onward. Inside, the Wellington turned its lights on in the morning, and the staff, now cataloged with their hidden talents, moved through their day with a little less invisibility and a little more voice. It is a small correction in the long ledger of labor. It is, however, the kind of story that matters because it proves a point that the numbers alone cannot. Institutions change when someone notices, when someone listens, and when the practice of noticing is made routine rather than exceptional. Olivia kept Professor Lee's card for a long time, not as proof, but as a reminder. The card read, in tiny print, a simple admonition. Knowledge is not merely possession, but a responsibility to translate. She did translate. The Wellington became, in its modest way, better for it. She would never be content to think this was a miracle. It was not. It was work, applied kindness, and an institutional pivot toward humility. It was a quiet victory, and in a world of many loud failures, the quieter kind is often the one that lasts. In the months that followed, the Wellington's new practices settled into a rhythm so steady it could be mistaken for ordinary housekeeping. The sign-up sheet lived in the staff room next to the rota, clipped under the same magnet that held notices about uniform laundry and fire drills. At first, it collected names with the cautious curiosity of people testing a kindness. A line scribbled, then another, then a block of time reserved here and there. Later, the spaces filled with the ease of something expected. Olivia kept folding. She folded as she had always folded. Crisp edges, exacting pleats, the motion practiced until it had the cadence of prayer. Her hands moved over cloth the way some hands trace the spines of books. That constancy was part of the lesson she taught by example. Recognition did not erase the work, it dignified it. The napkins were not props for a new role. They were proof that attention could be both aesthetic and sincere. When she taught others to notice, she taught them to keep the practice of craft alive. Training sessions were short and practical. Harrison insisted they be scheduled after the breakfast shift, when the staff could attend without leaving service gaps. His list of presenters began with the managers who had quietly rearranged their ideas of competence, then widened to include the line cooks, a receptionist who played violin for weddings, and a maintenance worker who, it turned out, had apprenticed as a sign writer in his youth. Olivia's module was small: how to make visible the small skills that settled under the surface of daily life. She asked people to describe what they did at home that nobody at work knew about. The answers, spoken in the half-light before a morning meeting over coffee-stained mugs, were ordinary and luminous. Someone baked bread to stabilize their household finances. Another tutored children in algebra. A porter repaired vintage radios on Sundays. The room learned the difference between bearing witness and spectacle. Not everyone welcomed the change. There were practical objections and a few that were less easy to name. One of the senior housekeeping supervisors, a woman who had worn the Wellington's pin for 22 years, watched the roll of visitors who came to observe with a skepticism sharpened by experience. She had seen initiatives arrive like weather fronts, loud, promising, gone within a season, leaving staff busier and faith thinner than before. She asked where the program's funding would come from, what would happen when the quarterly review required cuts. Harrison answered with budgets and projected revenue from improved guest satisfaction. Olivia answered with stories. Neither convinced her fully, so they did not attempt to convince all at once. They set up a 3-month review that would measure practice, not promise. Some of the most persuasive evidence arrived in the small, unpredictable ways institutions ultimately change. An email from a corporate client praising the attentiveness of staff who had been trained to notice food allergies before the guest mentioned them. A handwritten note left by a grandmother who had appreciated the receptionist's quiet kindness when the elevator jammed with a stroller. An internal memo from housekeeping noting a drop in lost and found complaints after the introduction of a simple inventory routine suggested by a night porter who had run a small market stall in his youth. Numbers mattered to Harrison, stories mattered to Olivia. Between them, the Wellington began to collect both. Professor Lee did return, though not with the parade of cameras that Olivia had feared. He came with a small group of graduate students who had been studying labor, language, and migration. They asked questions about process and precedent, about how the card had been used and whether it had come from a system or from grief. Olivia answered plainly. "It started with a need to speak," she said once. Then someone listened long enough to let words come. The students took notes. One of them recorded a line about translation as responsibility and later folded it into a paper that cited the Wellington as a modest case study. Professor Lee, quieter now, said little. He handed Olivia a copy of a pamphlet on civic engagement and smiled in a way that suggested he thought the story had, against expectation, been worth telling. The wider city smelled differently in spring. Word traveled not as herald but as example. Managers from a competing hotel phoned to ask where Wellington had found a chef who could do exquisite gluten-free gravies. A cafe owner down the avenue inquired about connecting with Wellington's night porter who had become known for fixing cafe equipment in the quiet hours. Those conversations did not transform the world overnight, but they stretched it a little, an elastic change that could rebound into new choices elsewhere. Olivia accepted an invitation to help craft the training materials. She drew borders around common sense. How to ask questions without making a person feel exposed. How to make the workplace a place where private knowledge could be offered voluntarily and honored. How to ensure that recognition translated into real opportunities, not hollow applause. She insisted on language that refused tokenism. "We do not make a person the story," she told Harrison in one meeting. "We make systems that hear stories."
Harrison, who had once measured his success in balance sheets and investor rooms, began to measure some of his choices by the degree to which they reduced the sense of shame in the staff room. There were scenes of awkwardness. An intern who, inexperienced in humility, praised the staff member in front of guests in a way that made the staff member flush and withdraw. A headline in a trade magazine that simplified Olivia's role into a single memorable line, as if she had been raised to an emblem rather than staying a working woman with a modest ledger of hope. Olivia met this with the gentle insistence that naming a person's skill did not require making them a spectacle. She visited staff one by one, folding napkins at the same table, listening. Her leadership was not charismatic so much as steady, a person who continued to do the small things and asked that systems do likewise. A conflict came, not in grand confrontation, but as an administrative challenge. The hotel's new procedure mandated that hiring interviews include a segment for skills beyond the job description. Some managers resented the extra time. A consultant suggested limiting the segment to best-fit candidates, an efficiency that would save minutes but risked losing the very nuance the initiative aimed to recover. Olivia and her allies argued for time, not for the sake of ceremony, but because time in interviews often revealed things that forms could not. A cashier's mention of embroidery that could be parlayed into a boutique seamstress offering uniform suggestions. A dishwasher's quiet reference to veterinary studies that might lead to weekend paid volunteer opportunities at a shelter. Harrison, who had grown fond of the incremental returns on this investment, overruled the consultant. He signed the protocol. Budgetary spreadsheets were adjusted to account for the extra 2 hours per hiring cycle. The staff began to offer each other informal mentorships. The receptionist who played violin taught basic music appreciation to the night staff. The maintenance worker who had painted signs taught a course on typography for the events team, and in time, the event's invitations looked crisper for it. A young waitress who had studied environmental science organized a simple recycling plan for the kitchen. The chefs, skeptical at first, noticed cost savings and adjusted prep procedures accordingly.
The small economies multiplied into better stories to tell guests, that the Wellington recycled thoughtfully, that it preferred local suppliers, that staff members had agency enough to propose alterations to menus. These were not headlines worth a press release, but they mattered to guests who came more than once. Olivia's family took little more interest than they had before. They were always interested in the work itself, the quiet dowry of craft that families inherit, but they did not consume the importance afforded to it by the institution. Her sister came to tea once and remarked on Olivia's calm. "You look different," she said, in the blunt way of family that notices changes in posture before they can be articulated. Olivia told her sister that it was a matter of practice, learning to ask, listening until the other person had a way to say more. "And to keep folding," she added, smiling. Her sister laughed, but the laugh was soft, respectful. There were moments of private pride that Olivia allowed herself. An unguarded compliment from a guest who had been moved by the careful arrangement of a table setting, a late email from a staff member who had been accepted into a weekend course because the hotel had paid the fee. But she protected herself from the idea of singular victory. The program was, in her view, a set of choices repeated often enough to become predictable. She measured success by the presence of those predictable choices. The bulleted list in the staff handbook, the training calendar that now had a permanent slot, the file of names who had been promoted from service roles into supervisory positions because their skills had been recognized long enough to be asked about. On a particular evening in late autumn, after a long day that had included a wedding and an unexpected blackout that the maintenance team handled with steady hands, Olivia found herself in the lobby with a stack of freshly laundered napkins. The hotel's marble shone under the lamps. A young trainee from housekeeping lingered, watching the way Olivia folded the cloth. He had been part of the early cohorts, someone who had been shy during the sessions and had once confided that he had studied urban planning in a country across the sea before economic pressures had redirected his life. He asked if Olivia would show him again, step by step. She did.
They worked in companionable silence. Twice, the trainee stopped to ask about a fold, and twice Olivia adjusted his fingers with a tenderness that belonged to people who teach hands. When they finished, the trainee placed the napkins into a neat pile. "When they put me on the rota to speak at the staff meeting," he said, almost as an aside, "I thought I'd be nervous. But then I remember folding these. It makes the rest make sense." Olivia nodded. "That is enough," she said. "Dignity is a practice. Practice is a way to speak without a microphone."
Harrison came down the steps then, carrying a small envelope with a tab of paper poking out. He walked over with the casual urgency of someone who had learned the value of small interventions. "We have another hotel asking to visit," he said, handing Olivia the envelope. Inside was a letter from a cluster of hoteliers in the city asking to see the Wellington system. Harrison shrugged in a private smile. "They want to know if this can be replicated," he said. Olivia read the letter, then looked at the trainee and the napkins, and then at the lobby, where guests moved like muted constellations. She thought of Professor Lee's card in her wallet, the admonition about translation, and felt the weight of it in her palm. Translating meant not only telling how something was done, but teaching others how to take up the work in their own hands, in their own contexts. "Yes," she said finally, "but it's not our method to export a model without the conditions. We'll show them the process, the failures, and the reasons we hold certain things close. They must be willing to keep folding." Harrison nodded, understanding more than he had a year before. "They'll come with note-taking and cameras," he said. "We'll ask them to sit in the laundry for a morning." Outside, the city had a hum of its own, the familiar choreography of commuting and late shoppers and delivery bikes. Inside, the Wellington kept turning its lights on and off. The staff collected for the next shift, the sign-up sheet waiting in its small corner like an invitation. Olivia took the envelope, made a small crease down its spine, and slipped it into her pocket. She straightened her shoulders as if preparing to teach something she believed was both true and imperfect. As she walked back toward the linen room, she kept one hand on the stack of napkins and the other in her pocket near the card she had long ago decided to keep. The action was almost automatic, a hand passing through routine to something else, and it felt like a vow. She would translate what she knew, but she would not forget the craft. She would fold, and she would invite others to fold with her. Recognition, after all, needed not only systems but people who continued to practice the small, exacting habits that kept dignity from becoming a slogan. Behind her in the staff room, someone laughed softly at a joke about the blackout, and the sign-up sheet received another neat signature. It was not a miracle, it was a series of choices made often enough to look like an institution of care. It was, in the quieter ledger of the city, a small, stubborn correction. Olivia folded another napkin, set it down with a precise corner, and prepared to show someone how the next fold began.